Right now, it's hard to imagine just being able to go outside and play. This virus has meant lots of things that we used to do all the time and took for granted are now impossible. I wonder what you're missing most in lockdown. Perhaps it's friends and family who you haven't been able to see. Perhaps it's just being able to do things like go to the shops or the cinema. Perhaps it's just being free to go wherever you want, whenever you feel like it. What would you do if you were free? 75 years ago, people were having very similar conversations. They weren't fighting a worldwide virus, but a world war. It wasn't quite such an invisible enemy, but many of the people who died were ordinary people in homes and cities, a long way from the people who were trying to harm them, people who they never even saw. The world had been at war for 6 years, since September 1939. There'd been air raids and bombings with towns and cities destroyed, leaving people without anywhere to live. Families were split up. Children were sent away to the countryside to be kept safe, a bit like us in lockdown. Here are Mrs. King's uncle and aunt. Fathers went off to fight. Mothers worked in factories or fields. It was a very frightening time. Much like today for many people. It was a long time ago, and many of those people are no longer with us. But their children and grandchildren are. Here are some from our school. See if you can spot any family resemblances. This is my great auntie Sally on the right. She drove an ambulance in Newcastle during the Blitz. That was a very unusual job for a woman back then. Here's Mrs. King's father in his army uniform. And Mrs. King's auntie, also in uniform. This is Mrs. Gorringe's father-in-law, Norman Gorringe. And this is Mrs. Denye's father. Mrs. Wood's granddad, Alex McLean, aged about 21. Mrs. Fretton's grandpa, he was in the Navy, and here he is with some of his shipmates. Mrs. Girdleston's granddad, he actually served in 2 world wars and was in the Merchant Navy. Mrs. Ebel's granddad, Albert Day, fought in Italy, and Mrs. Ebel's other granddad, Cyril Pegg. They all look so smart. When I was your age, the war was a much more recent thing, of course. My parents were young children during it. My teachers had fought in the war, and people talked about those times, good times and bad. I went to France with my school, just as many of you will. This was still some time after the war, but there was lots of evidence of the fighting. In the shop in the village we stayed in, they were selling bullets. Not live ammunition, but bullets that had been found after the war and made safe. I was fascinated by the war. When my friends spent the money their parents had given them on sweets, I saved it up and bought these bullets. I've still got them. The stories of the war were made into films and books and comics, and the memories of it lived on. In years to come, you will remember life during this lockdown too. There'll be books and there'll be films and stories about it. And you'll tell your children about when the schools were closed and you couldn't go out. One day the world will be safe again, and it will be okay to go outside, to meet friends and not have to stand 2 meters apart, to do the things we're missing doing now. I wonder what we'll do. Perhaps we'll have a great big party, the whole country, everyone out in the streets, music playing, dancing, eating, drinking, playing games, and all together, just happy that the virus has gone. This is what happened when the war ended. Huge celebrations to mark victory in Europe, VE Day, May the 8th, 1945, 75 years ago today, and that is what we are celebrating now, the end of fighting in Europe. At 3 p.m, the Prime Minister Winston Churchill waved to the crowds filling the streets in London, and then went to Buckingham Palace to stand on the balcony with the King. The lady on the left of the screen is Princess Elizabeth, who is now our Queen. Joe and Summer Holland's great-grand was there, outside Buckingham Palace, and this is the actual flag she waved. Other people held street parties with tables and chairs taking the place of cars. Here is Mrs. Fretton's auntie looking at the camera at her VE Day street party. In London, parties went on well into the night and roads and squares filled with people. This is a very famous photo of two girls and two sailors in the fountains in Trafalgar Square. Many years after the war, some journalists tracked the girls down. They were called Cynthia and Joyce, and they were both land girls working on farms in Surrey. After the war, they married Canadian soldiers and both went to live in Canada, but they stayed friends throughout their lives until they died just a few years ago. Mrs. King's mum was also in Trafalgar Square celebrating VE Day. It must have been a great party. When the war ended and the parties died down, the soldiers, sailors and airmen began to come home. Miss Hedges' granddad was awarded these medals for his time in the military police in Ceylon. We now call it Sri Lanka. There were church services to give thanks and to remember those who lost their lives, those who couldn't come home. Not everyone felt like celebrating. For some people it was a happy time, but they were sad too because they had lost loved ones or their homes had been damaged in air raids. It took a long time to rebuild the damage that the war had done. I remember going to London when I was a teenager, many years after the war, and seeing places there that were still in ruins. But the end of the war brought hope, hope for a peaceful future. Hope is so important. It's not a magic wand, but it does give us something to aim for. VE Day marked the end of fighting and the start of a new future. One day we will come out of lockdown and we will celebrate beating the virus, just as people celebrated peace 75 years ago today on the streets of Britain. Just as they did, we will be able to look forward, and we will be able to look back as well and say thank you. So thank you to those brave men and women who fought for our country in the Second World War, making VE Day, Victory in Europe, possible. And thank you to those brave men and women who fought for our lives this year. And as we think about the future, let's think about how we can make a difference, just like those people in 1945 did. How can we turn these bullets into a symbol of peace? What can we do today to help bring peace and harmony where we live from now on?